In this presentation, I would like to discuss the general structure and process of writing a research thesis. So first we will define what a research thesis is, and then we will discuss its structure and the general process involved in the writing of a research thesis report. So the first question is, what is a research thesis? Or in other words, what is a research thesis report? A research thesis report is a comprehensive written report that describes in detail the aims and objectives, the rationale, the background, the research methodology, the outcomes or results, and the implications of a research project. So, in summary, we can say that a thesis report, or a thesis as is generally known, is basically a written report on the aims, processes, and the product of the research project. Generally, this is a part of the research degree qualification, and this is generally a requirement in most degree awarding, research degree awarding universities and institutions. Now, we will now discuss the general structure of a research thesis. Well, there are a number of sections in which the general research thesis or thesis report is generally divided. And so these, I have actually identified these seven sections or seven parts of the thesis report. The first one is the preliminary pages, which actually is the introductory pages or the beginning pages, and these include the title page and the approval sheets, because as you know that theses are presented as part of the degree qualification. So the examiners and the supervisors need to approve the thesis, and so there is a particular page that is called the approval sheet. And so this is a part of the preliminary pages. Then in many theses, or rather I should say most theses, there is an acknowledgement section where the student researcher acknowledges or the researcher acknowledges the contribution on the part of people and maybe institution or organizations. So generally, the supervisor is, for example, one of the people who is generally acknowledged for his contribution to the thesis. Then there might be a dedication page as well, where in some cases some research students want to dedicate the thesis to maybe some individuals or to some institutions or groups or and things like that. So there is a dedication section. Then, most importantly, the abstract is also considered as one of the most important part of the research report, because the abstract actually is a kind of summary of the whole research thesis, a very brief summary of the whole research thesis. And this is generally a page or a few paragraphs. The length of will vary in line with the requirements of universities or degree awarding institutions. So this is a part of preliminary pages. Then there is a list of contents. In some cases, there is list of abbreviations and list of tables in the preliminary pages as well. So these are the general contents of the preliminary pages, but there might be other contents in response to the requirements of particular degree awarding or institutions or universities. Then the introduction, which is generally included as chapter 1. Here there is a brief introduction to the topic and to the topic and to the thesis as well. This chapter also includes the objectives of the study and the research questions or hypotheses and the rationale or significance of the study. This section, in some cases, this chapter also has in brief information or in brief introduction to the remaining chapters. So that generally comes towards the end of this chapter. Then the next the next section, which is generally chapter 2 or literature review, is basically a detailed, critical, and comprehensive review of related literature. And related literature actually means literature that is relevant to the topic. Generally, this is done in order to give a good and comprehensive background to the reader of the thesis, and also to possibly to identify areas or gaps that the current research aims to fill. And so literature review is a very important and often an essential part of most research theses. The literature review generally is arranged in line with the research objectives, and most of the themes and the sub-themes relevant to the topic and to the research objectives or questions are actually covered in this particular chapter. So generally chapter 2 is perhaps the most comprehensive and the longest chapter in the thesis. Then comes the research methodology chapter, which is the third important but generally the fourth section of the thesis. And the chapter 3 or the research methodology chapter includes information related to research design or research type. So what type of research has been conducted, whether it's quantitative research or qualitative research, for example, or a mixed method research, or there is some subcategory of these main research study types. This also includes justification for the selection of the particular research design. Then the population and sample information is also included in this chapter. The data collection and analysis tools and processes, and also the authentication of the research, which means the validity and reliability and ethical considerations related to the conduct of the particular research study are included in this particular chapter. So again, chapter 3 or research methodology chapter is generally a very, very important chapter. Here, details are given, not just related to the what of the methodology, but also about the how and the why, which actually means the justification of the research methodology are given in this. So this chapter should be is generally considered as a very critical chapter, because especially for research students, as they are expected to have good knowledge of the research methodology at this stage, because after the completion of their thesis, they should be able to conduct independent research studies, and therefore understanding the concepts of research methodology is very important. And a good quality critical chapter 3 and systematically written chapter 3 is something that indicates the level of understanding of research methodology of the research students. And so therefore, this is a very important chapter, and that needs a lot of reading and discussions and analysis and justification on the part of the research students. Then comes the next chapter, the results findings chapter, or in most cases it is called chapter 4. This section presents the findings of the research study in the light of research objectives. Organization, tabulation, presentation, and analysis of data are some of the things that are done in this particular chapter. And so the research findings or results are organized in line with research objectives. And if there is a quantitative type of data, generally there will be tabulation. On the other hand, in qualitative type of data, there will be less tabulations, but there will be more presentation of the textual data. And so the presentation of findings and also the analysis of findings is something that is included in this chapter. And once again, this is an important chapter because it is the findings for which the whole research process is being conducted. So presenting the findings in an organized way, presenting the findings clearly, presenting the findings in line with the research objectives is something that is very important. And so a well-organized chapter 4 actually gives the reader a clear idea of what has been accomplished in this particular thesis. Then comes the conclusion chapter, or chapter 5. Here, this is basically a summary and then a conclusion on the basis of that summary of the whole thesis. The summary of the research processes and the outcomes is included in this particular section. Then this is followed by a discussion. In some cases, discussion is done in chapter 4 after findings, but in other universities or in other institutions, discussion happens after a summary of the findings in the last part of chapter 5 of the thesis. So research students have to look at the particular formats of their universities. This chapter also has a conclusion. So you overall concluding of, so what do we actually conclude from the whole thesis? And so the conclusion is something where, again, the researcher actually comes up with more independent, kind of critically looking at the findings, and then on the basis of those findings comes up with conclusions which are actually objective, and they are precisely presented, and they are in response to the findings of the study, rather than in many cases students make this mistake of making very general type of conclusions. From the conclusion, then the next part is recommendations. So in many cases, there is requirement that the researcher should also recommend possible steps to be taken, or possible changes, or what are actually the implications of the study. So researchers are expected to recommend to the government or to the society or to institutions on the basis of what are their findings and what have they concluded from those findings. So again, recommendation is an important part of the thesis. Then suggestion for further studies is also like an important part, because the researcher has conducted this study, and the researcher actually knows a good deal about the length and breadth of the topic that he or she has studied, or for example, if it's a PhD study over many years. So then know that generally a research study has limited scope, and so perhaps there are areas that have not been covered so far. So suggestions for further studies actually help other researchers to go beyond this particular thesis and to explore the areas further. And so this helps in identifying gaps. This helps other researchers or junior researchers in actually making it a base for conducting further research and further exploring the particular field that has been studied. Then the last important part actually is the references section, which is like the citations. As we know that in most theses there is citation. So other sources of information have been referred to in the body of the thesis report, and so full references need to be given towards the end. And so the thesis report also has this section where references or the work that has been cited, details related to those have been actually that needs to be included towards the end as references. Appendices actually may include list of references. Appendices actually may also include research tools that have been used. So generally, the research tools, consent forms or details about sample or research site, or other relevant documents that the researchers think might help the readers in the contextual understanding of the thesis, and they generally are not included in the body of the text. They are included as appendices. So in some cases the appendices come after references, but I have also seen that in some cases appendices come before references. But generally a better practice is that appendices come towards the very end of the thesis after references. Now we are moving to the last part of the presentation, and that is that research thesis, understanding the process of it. So how actually is the whole thesis process, the whole thesis writing process, how does it take place? How is it that we get a whole book, a thesis in the book form? So how do we get to that particular stage where we have a thesis in a complete book, printed and hard copy form? Well, this is quite time-taking, time-consuming, and a very long process in many cases. And this is also a very systematic process. So there are certain steps involved in that process, and I would briefly discuss those steps. One is that the writing the first draft. You need to write the first draft. Generally, there are two ways in which one can do that. One is that one should write the whole thesis once as a full draft, but that generally doesn't happen because actually the thesis has been preceded by a research proposal that has been accepted and on the basis of that research proposal, the thesis has been then conducted, the research has been conducted, and the thesis has been written. So we already have certain sections or certain chapters of the thesis that have been partially written. For example, chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3. So generally what happens while you are working on the draft of your thesis is that you write the draft. For example, you write chapter 1 as a draft, and then you revise it, and then you rewrite it, because revision tells you there are areas that need to be improved in terms of language, in terms of critical analysis, in terms of structure, and so you rewrite that. And peer review, then you can give it to for peer review to maybe peers such as colleagues or classmates or students who are actually colleagues and they are PhD or research students, other research students. Then supervisory feedback comes once you have written the first draft, let's say, of chapter 1, and then you give it to your supervisor for feedback. In the light of, so the supervisor goes through that and he or she gives you feedback. That feedback then gives you some material for reflection. So on the feedback you reflect, and again you revise your thesis or your draft of that particular chapter, and then you rewrite that, and again you give it to your supervisor and get feedback. Generally, writing, getting feedback, rewriting, revising, it takes several times, it takes several attempts before the supervisor will finalize or okays your draft. So once, with every chapter you do this, you write the chapter or the draft, you revise it, you rewrite it, you peer review it, you give it to your supervisor for feedback, you get feedback, and you actually reflect on that feedback, you rewrite, revise your draft, and again a number of times in many cases, depending on the kind of feedback that you get, depending on your own abilities, how well you are actually incorporating the supervisor's feedback, and also depending to some extent on the kind of supervisor that you have. If there is a supervisor who is very keen on improving the quality of your thesis to the optimum level before submission, obviously you have to do quite a few drafts before it gets to the next stage, which is like the submission of your thesis. And so once you have done this cyclic process of writing, revising, rewriting, peer reviewing, getting feedback, incorporating feedback, improving your thesis once and twice and thrice and so a number of times before the supervisor gives it a final okay. The next thing before you submit your thesis for further process or evaluation, formal evaluation process, the last step is actually proofreading it. So proofreading, formatting, and finalizing is something that will aid to the value of your thesis in terms of improving its quality and its structure and its format and content. And so you can see that the process of writing the research thesis is quite time consuming, and it is, one can say that it is something that actually requires a lot of effort, a good deal of dedication, and perseverance and a good deal of thinking and flexibility as well. And the whole process ultimately leads to the final product of this process, which is called the research thesis. Thank you very much for your time. Take care. Bye.